Sarah Collins had never intended to overhear anything. She was a housekeeper, not a spy. For nearly 3 years she had worked quietly inside the Hartman estate, a sprawling limestone mansion tucked into Chicago's affluent Gold Coast. Her routine was clockwork. Arrive before sunrise, dust, polish, clean, and leave without a trace. The Hartmans were the kind of family that expected their staff to be invisible. And Sarah had perfected invisibility. Until that morning. The house was unusually quiet when she stepped into the library, the soft hum of the central air the only sound. She'd been wiping down the marble fireplace when a low murmur caught her attention from the adjoining study, an area strictly off-limits during family meetings. She froze, rag in hand, heart giving a nervous flutter. Voices. A man and a woman. The woman's voice was unmistakable, Victoria Hartman. Calm, clipped, cold. "He won't be coming back," Victoria said, her tone coated in a chilling certainty. Sarah's eyes darted toward the slightly ajar door. The man responded, voice unfamiliar, low and rough around the edges. "Are you sure it'll look like an accident?" Victoria's laugh was soft, almost amused. "Of course, Evans. I've covered bigger scandals through the foundation. This won't be any different." Sarah's stomach tightened. Evans. She'd never heard the name in the house before, yet the way Victoria spoke to him suggested familiarity, conspiracy even. And the foundation. Sarah knew Victoria chaired a high-profile charity, but gossip among the staff often hinted it was little more than a front for laundering money. Now it sounded far worse. The conversation continued in hushed tones, words blending with the soft shuffle of papers. Sarah didn't dare move. Victoria's voice lowered to a near whisper. "Daniel won't suspect a thing. He trusts me. He always has." The air thickened around Sarah, suffocating. Daniel Hartman, Victoria's husband and the owner of one of Chicago's largest investment firms, was heading out on a business trip that weekend. It was all over the morning news. She felt a knot twist in her chest. They were talking about Daniel. About his trip. About making sure he didn't come back. Her first instinct was to back away, to flee the room and pretend she'd heard nothing. This wasn't her world. People like Victoria and Evans played by rules Sarah didn't understand, and didn't want to. She was a housekeeper, invisible, and that invisibility had kept her safe. But her feet refused to move. The weight of what she was hearing pinned her in place. Victoria and this man, Evans, were plotting something dark. And Daniel had no idea. Sarah clenched the rag in her hands, her heart thudding painfully in her ears. Could she really just walk away? Pretend this wasn't happening? The thought clawed at her conscience, leaving a sour taste in her mouth. She wasn't naive. She knew the rich had their secrets. She'd cleaned enough to see glimpses of lives layered with lies. But this wasn't an affair or hidden money. This was a man's life. And if she stayed silent, his blood could end up on her hands. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to move. Each step away from the library felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to drag her back. By the time she reached the service hallway, her hands were slick with sweat. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Who was Evans? Was Victoria really capable of murder? And what would happen to Sarah if they found out she'd overheard them? She wasn't stupid. A woman like Victoria wouldn't hesitate to make her disappear if she became a problem. That thought nearly sent her back into hiding. But something stronger pushed her forward. A quiet, stubborn part of her, the same part that had gotten her through years of hard work, unfair treatment and silent endurance, refused to let her stand by and do nothing. Later that afternoon, Sarah watched from a distance as Daniel walked through the grand hall, flanked by assistants and drowned in the blur of his busy world. He barely noticed the people around him. He wouldn't notice her. But Sarah squared her shoulders and approached, blending her steps with the swirl of staff moving in and out of the corridor. As Daniel paused to check his watch, Sarah passed him quietly, her voice low enough not to draw attention. "Mr. Hartman, be careful on your trip. Not everything is as it seems." He looked up, startled, his brow furrowing as their eyes met for the briefest moment. She didn't wait for a response. She kept walking, heart pounding, unsure if she'd done the right thing. But deep inside, Sarah knew this: she had crossed a line she could never uncross. And nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The morning after Sarah whispered her warning to Daniel, nothing seemed different. The Hartman estate bustled with its usual quiet efficiency. Staff moved like clockwork, carrying trays of breakfast and tidying up the grand halls. Daniel Hartman left for meetings downtown, his polished shoes echoing across the marble floors as if nothing had happened. Sarah went about her work trying to convince herself that maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe Victoria's conversation wasn't what it sounded like. Maybe Daniel wasn't really in danger. But deep down she knew better. She tried to stay focused on her duties, but every time she caught a glimpse of Daniel walking past, her pulse jumped. He gave no sign of suspicion, no indication that her words had meant anything to him. She saw him in passing during the afternoon, standing by the staircase, flipping through messages on his phone, calm and composed. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. Should she say something again? Should she push him harder? But then Daniel glanced her way, just a brief look, and their eyes met. There was something in his expression she hadn't expected. Not annoyance. Not anger. Curiosity. And maybe, buried deep within, a flicker of doubt. She quickly looked away, returning to polishing a vase as if nothing had happened. By the end of her shift, Sarah convinced herself that whatever seed she had planted in Daniel's mind, it wasn't enough. She left the estate that evening under a heavy sky, a soft drizzle misting the Chicago streets. The air felt thicker than usual, heavy with a tension she couldn't shake. She walked the 10 blocks back to her apartment in Lakeshore, shoulders hunched against the damp wind. The narrow street where she lived was quiet as always, row houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, front steps slick with rain. She reached her door, fished for her keys, and that's when she saw it. A crisp white envelope, carefully placed on her doorstep. No address. No stamp. Her name written across the front in sharp, deliberate handwriting. Sarah froze. Her first thought was irrational. Victoria had found out. This was it. But as her eyes scanned the envelope again, she recognized the handwriting. Daniel's. The realization hit her like a jolt. She snatched up the envelope and hurried inside, bolting the door behind her. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key attached to a simple silver keychain engraved with the words Lakeshore Heights. The note was brief, written in the same confident script. For your safety. Sarah sat down on the edge of her worn couch, the letter in one hand, the key in the other. Her mind spun. Lakeshore Heights was a luxury apartment complex overlooking the harbor, a world away from the cramped one-bedroom she rented. She'd cleaned apartments like that. She'd never imagined stepping inside one as a resident. What was this? Some kind of reward? A gesture? Or was Daniel actually concerned? She read the note again, tracing the letters with her thumb. The words, for your safety, echoed louder in her mind with each passing second. It didn't make sense. Daniel hadn't acknowledged her warning. He hadn't called her aside, hadn't said a word. And yet now this. The realization settled in slowly. He had taken her seriously, at least enough to do something. Maybe he believed her more than he let on. Maybe he knew more than he showed. For a moment, relief washed over Sarah, but it didn't last. Later that night, as she stepped out to buy groceries, a black sedan rolled slowly down her street. The windows were tinted, the engine humming softly as it coasted past. It moved too slow for casual traffic. The driver's face wasn't visible. Sarah stopped on the sidewalk, groceries clutched tightly in her hand, and watched as the car disappeared around the corner. She told herself it was nothing. Just a coincidence. Chicago was full of strange drivers. But the next evening it happened again. A different car. Parked across the street. The same dark windows. The same stillness. No one got out. No one spoke. It sat there for 20 minutes before finally driving off. Sarah watched from behind her curtain, heart pounding in her chest. The following morning, as she left for work, she felt eyes on her. It wasn't just paranoia. A man in a gray coat leaned against the brick wall near the train station. He wasn't reading. He wasn't waiting for a ride. He just watched. When Sarah caught his gaze, he looked away, lit a cigarette, and turned his back. By the time she reached the Hartman estate, her nerves were stretched thin. She moved through her tasks like a ghost, her mind fixed on the slow, creeping sense of being hunted. The key Daniel had given her burned in her pocket all day. The apartment waiting for her in Lakeshore Heights no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a warning. An unspoken message that the world she had stumbled into was darker, and closer, than she ever imagined. The days that followed settled into a strange, suffocating rhythm. Sarah moved between her shifts at the Hartman estate and the silent walls of her Lakeshore Heights apartment, never shaking the feeling of eyes watching her from across streets or shadowed doorways. Every time she turned a corner, her heart raced. The black sedans kept appearing, never the same one twice, never staying long but always there, hovering like silent warnings. By the end of the week, Sarah knew she couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. One afternoon, as she was changing the linens in one of the guest rooms, her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. The number was unknown, the kind that made her chest tighten before she even answered. She stepped into the hallway, checked over her shoulder, and picked up. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, professional. "Miss Collins, this is Detective Carter Simmons with the Chicago Police. I believe we need to talk." Sarah froze. Her first instinct was panic. Had Daniel called the police on her? Had Victoria found out? But the detective's voice wasn't accusatory. If anything, it sounded concerned. He suggested they meet privately at a diner on the south side. Sarah arrived half an hour early, sitting in a cracked vinyl booth sipping bitter coffee until a tall, sharply dressed man in his 40s walked in and slid into the seat across from her. He introduced himself as Detective Simmons and got straight to the point. He told her that Daniel Hartman had been working with him off the record for nearly 6 months. Sarah blinked, struggling to absorb the words. Simmons explained that Daniel suspected his wife, Victoria, of involvement in illegal business dealings. Embezzlement, fraud, and something darker that he hadn't been able to prove. Victoria had built an empire through her so-called charity work, but Daniel believed she used it to launder money for powerful people. When Sarah's warning reached Daniel, it confirmed what he had been fearing. Victoria was capable of much worse than financial crimes. Simmons leaned closer, lowering his voice. What Sarah didn't know, what few people knew, was that Daniel and her father, Richard Collins, had once been business partners. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. Simmons explained that 2 decades ago, before Daniel's rise to power, he and Richard had started a small private investment group. They had been close friends even. But just as their business began attracting serious investors, Richard vanished without a trace. The police had investigated but turned up nothing. Officially, Richard was listed as missing. Sarah sat frozen, her hands gripping the chipped edge of the table. Her father had never spoken of a business partner. She had been a child when he disappeared, left only with the memory of a man who worked too much and smiled too little. Her mother had said it was an accident, a business trip gone wrong. But hearing it now from a detective, the missing pieces of her life slamming into place, shattered something inside her. Simmons continued, his eyes steady on hers. Daniel had never given up trying to find out what happened. Over the years, he had gathered hints, whispers in the dark. And every lead seemed to circle back to Victoria. Sarah felt her throat tighten. The idea that Victoria wasn't just scheming against her husband but had been connected to her father's disappearance hit with a cold, relentless weight. That night, Sarah returned to her apartment feeling as if she were walking through a dream she couldn't wake from. The walls of Lakeshore Heights felt closer than ever, their pristine white surfaces sterile, suffocating. She paced the floor, questions crowding her mind. Why hadn't Daniel told her about her father? Was it guilt? Fear? Or something darker? She sat on the edge of her bed staring at the key Daniel had given her, her mind racing with images of Victoria's cold smile and whispered threats. It couldn't be a coincidence. Victoria and Evans. The foundation. Her father. It was all tangled in a web she didn't understand, but she was caught in it now, deep in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Just past midnight, her phone rang. The number was blocked. Sarah hesitated, her pulse quickening before she picked up. The voice on the other end was male, smooth, almost friendly. "Sarah. I've heard you've been asking questions." She recognized it immediately, Mark Evans. He didn't wait for her to respond. It's a dangerous habit. People who ask too many questions, they tend to disappear. The line went dead before Sarah could speak. She sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her heart thundering in her chest. The message was clear. Mark Evans knew she was involved. And now she was officially part of a deadly game she didn't understand. A game where the rules were written in secrets and the stakes were measured in lives. 2 days after the phone call, Sarah met Daniel in a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of Chicago. The atmosphere was thick with unease. Daniel looked different from his polished public image, tired, sharper around the edges, like a man who hadn't slept in days. The weight of what they both now knew hung between them, unspoken but suffocating. They sat for nearly an hour, piecing together what little they had. The plan wasn't perfect, but they didn't have time to perfect it. They needed evidence, something concrete, something that would tie Victoria to Richard Collins' disappearance, the Foundation's criminal dealings, and whatever Daniel feared was still coming. Daniel revealed that the Hartman family owned a secluded property in Lake Forest, an estate that had been in Victoria's family for generations. Victoria used it as a private retreat, a place no one visited without her express permission. Daniel believed it held the files, the proof they needed. But the house wasn't abandoned. It was guarded, even if discreetly. They couldn't go in alone. That's when Mark Evans reached out. Sarah hadn't expected it. Mark claimed he wanted out, said he was tired of playing Victoria's games. He approached Daniel first, offering information, a way into the estate, security codes, guard shifts. He insisted he wanted immunity, protection, and a clean slate. Daniel was cautious but desperate enough to take the offer seriously. Sarah, however, wasn't convinced. Mark was too smooth, his charm too practiced. His timing felt suspicious, like he was playing both sides. But Daniel pressed on, and Sarah couldn't risk staying behind. She had come too far to walk away now. On a fog-soaked Thursday night, they made their move. Mark led them through the woods behind the estate, moving with the confidence of a man who had done this before. He disabled the alarm on the back gate, guided them through a side entrance, and whispered every step like a script he knew by heart. Sarah followed close behind, her heart hammering against her ribs with every shadow they passed. The mansion loomed dark and silent, its windows like blind eyes watching their every move. Inside, the place was colder than Sarah expected, grand halls echoing with emptiness, air thick with dust and old secrets. Mark led them toward the library, where a hidden study, according to him, held Victoria's private files. Daniel moved with tense precision, scanning every corner. Sarah tried to quiet the storm inside her head, focusing on the mission, the goal. But doubt clawed at her gut. Was Mark truly helping them? Or was this a carefully laid trap? They reached the study, a narrow chamber behind a false panel in the wall. Daniel found the latch, pulled it open, and they slipped inside. It was everything Sarah imagined, dark wood shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a polished desk, a heavy safe bolted into the wall. Mark stood watch at the door while Daniel knelt before the safe, working a small electronic device into the lock. Sarah's nerves stretched thin with every second that passed. Then it happened. The door slammed open with a force that rattled the shelves. Victoria stood in the doorway, flanked by two men in dark suits, their eyes sharp, their expressions colder than the steel they carried in their hands. Victoria's voice sliced through the room like glass. "Well, isn't this a charming surprise?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. She glanced at Mark, who stood perfectly still, too still. Her heart dropped. This had been a setup. Victoria's smile was cruel as she stepped inside, her eyes locking on Daniel. "I should have known you'd bring your little housekeeper along for the ride." Daniel rose slowly, his hands in the air, eyes narrowing at Victoria. But before anyone could speak, Mark did something Sarah hadn't expected. He turned on Victoria. In a blur of movement, he grabbed the arm of the nearest guard, twisting the weapon from his hand with a force that sent the man crashing to the floor. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos exploded in the room. Daniel lunged for the second guard, shoving him against the wall as Sarah darted toward the safe, grabbing the bundle of documents Daniel had already loosened. Mark wrestled Victoria back, pinning her arms before she could reach for anything hidden in her coat. Sarah's vision blurred with adrenaline as she ran. She didn't wait to see if Daniel or Mark followed. She bolted through the hallways, documents clutched tight to her chest. Footsteps pounded behind her, some friends, some foes, but she didn't stop. Every instinct screamed for her to run faster, move quicker. By the time they burst out into the cold night air, the headlights of their getaway car sliced through the fog. Daniel sprinted beside her, Mark close behind, all three of them gasping for breath. They jumped into the car as the guards shouted from behind, the engine roaring to life as they sped down the long driveway into the darkness. Sarah didn't look back. They had the evidence. And for the first time in weeks, it felt like they had a chance. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Victoria wasn't the kind of woman to lose quietly. The morning after their narrow escape, Sarah and Daniel met Detective Simmons in a quiet corner of a government building downtown. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the city outside was just beginning to stir, but inside that stark, fluorescent-lit office, everything felt frozen in a moment of reckoning. Simmons unfolded the stack of documents on the table, his eyes narrowing as he flipped through page after page of files they had taken from the Lake Forest estate. 4 long, silent minutes, Sarah sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched his expression darken with every new discovery. Among the forged contracts, embezzlement records, and coded financial ledgers, they found something else. A sealed folder marked with nothing but a single name, Richard Collins. Simmons opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and a detailed timeline. The pieces Sarah had spent her life missing stared back at her in sharp, undeniable print. Richard Collins hadn't vanished on a business trip. He had been targeted, set up by Victoria's family for exposing financial crimes within their network. The documents detailed how he'd discovered irregularities in their offshore accounts, how he had tried to confront them, and how they had orchestrated his disappearance. A car accident that wasn't an accident at all. Sarah's breath caught in her chest as Simmons leaned back in his chair, his voice low but firm when he finally spoke. The evidence wasn't just solid, it was damning. Enough to charge Victoria Hartman with conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and a slew of other crimes stretching back 2 decades. The walls of power and influence Victoria had built were about to collapse, and this time, there would be no buying her way out. That afternoon, Victoria Hartman was arrested outside her office on Michigan Avenue. The image of her being led away in handcuffs quickly flooded the media, Chicago's queen of philanthropy, exposed as the mastermind of a criminal empire. Sarah watched it unfold from a safe distance, a mixture of relief and disbelief rolling through her. It felt surreal. After weeks of shadows, whispered threats, and gut-wrenching fear, it was finally over. In the weeks that followed, investigators tore through Victoria's assets. The foundation was seized, her accounts frozen. Mark Evans testified in exchange for protection, and Daniel's cooperation with the authorities sealed the case. The headlines told a story of betrayal and scandal, but they didn't come close to capturing the truth Sarah now carried inside her. Her father's name was finally cleared. One rainy morning, Simmons called Sarah back to his office. He had news that left her more stunned than she'd ever been. According to the paperwork found in Victoria's files, Richard Collins had been an equal partner in the early days of the Hartman investments. His share of the company, hidden and buried under layers of forged documents, was still legally his. Or more accurately, his heirs. Sarah sat in silence as Simmons explained that she was now entitled to a significant portion of what had once been her father's legacy. Daniel confirmed it, offering legal support if she chose to claim it. But Sarah didn't hesitate. She thanked them both and declined. Money had never been what she was after. She didn't want Victoria's tainted fortune. She wanted peace, closure, and a life untouched by the greed and darkness that had stolen her father away. Instead, Sarah did something no one expected. Using her modest savings and with Daniel's quiet backing, she established the Richard Collins Foundation, a legitimate charity dedicated to helping families affected by financial crimes and corporate exploitation. She poured herself into the work, finding purpose in giving a voice to those silenced by power and corruption. The irony wasn't lost on her. Victoria had used charity as a cover for her crimes. Sarah would use it as a way to heal. Months passed. The scandal faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories, fresher scandals. But Sarah didn't care. Her world had shifted. The fear that once clung to her like a second skin was gone. She no longer looked over her shoulder. The past no longer owned her. One crisp autumn evening, Sarah stood by the edge of Lake Michigan, watching the water stretch into the fading light. The breeze was sharp against her skin, the city skyline glowing behind her like a silent witness to everything she had survived. The air smelled of rain and change. She breathed it in deeply, her heart steady, her mind finally at peace. For the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't running, hiding, or fearing what might come next. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. The future was hers, and for once it felt like freedom.